So these topics are important to keep in mind when we look at the literary theory of Wordsworth and Shelley and the defense of poetry, um, as well as to keep in mind just when you're reading um, the literature itself. Um, so Wordsworth, for example, it's so easy to think of him as a nostalgic romantic, a romantic about idealizing flowers and peasants and sort of anti-modern. Um, and on the one hand, that's not wrong. Um, Wordsworth had the misfortune among romantic poets of living to not dying young. And people tend to get more conservative as they get older, and certainly that's the case with Wordsworth. But the lyrical ballads is a subversive piece of literature. Wordsworth was, in fact, supporter of the French Revolution as a young man, and so I think what's at stake in his advocacy of the ordinary language of men, it's important to pay attention to um, to the actual subversive aspect of that, um, which has to do with the experience of music. Um, and the critique of consumerism, why he um, resists the conventional flowery virtuosity of an Alexander Pope traditional poetry is because that's too easily bought. That what you're getting. There's a whole. I mean, it's similar to the class and sexual or racial ideologies that I was just talking about in the Apple ad. There's a class ideology to fancy poetry, um, and that you buy into. You know why you're supposed to like this. And that's what Wordsworth wants to disrupt. To use irony. Irony is just a disruption of meaning, a disruption of the stability of meaning. That's to say, a disruption of the conventional social value that is associated with literature. Um, think about popular music. Like, I don't know, when I was young, the grunge music, that was kind of the most popular music. And it's interesting for me to think now that how like dark, I listen to the Smiths a lot. It's like so dark. So, but what's interesting is like pop icons, you know, people fall in love to pop music. So it's a bit deeply ironic, the structure of that kind of art. Um, to idolize Kurt Cobain or Morrissey, it's to feel love, but because of their skepticism about love. May seem like a stretch to compare Wordsworth to Kurt Cobain. I already compared Wordsworth to that dancing, rapping squirrel. Um, but what I'm trying to point out is, I think, something familiar in a familiar signature feature of modern popular culture. It depends on irony. So um, that it's like memes that are interactive. It's interactive. If it's not, if it doesn't have that ironic edge of cleverness, like there's some reason I shouldn't like this, but I actually do. It's as Wordsworth said, um, the artist has to create the taste by which he is enjoyed. So that's a very modern um, sentiment and conception of how art works, which is that it's creating the public, it's creating its own audience. That's a very modern um, con- uh, experience of art. You know, I think a pre-modern experience of art is to connect us kind of to the past and a repetition of a traditional um, experience of the value communicated by art. Um, but I think we want art to shake us up and create something new. Um, so that's what I think is an important aspect of what Wordsworth is doing, and it also has this another thing that maybe is especially has gotten more familiar recently is this kind of DIY, like punk rock. Anybody can do it. There's nothing elevated or elitist about art. That it should be kind of in principle like grassroots, that it should come up from the experience of ordinary people, and that's where the most kind of vital creativity comes from. um, and I think hence that emphasis on idleness, that it's not about lofty craft, but about um, just detaching somewhat from the rat race, the machine of social life and productivity, and seeing the world on one's own terms, and enjoying just the form itself of communication. I think that's really crucial. Just like the form of music, um, there's something subversive about that communication, uh, in terms that aren't about the Protestant work ethic or individual consumerism, um, because those are so captivating and compelling in modern society. Um, so, just this is a famous line. I haven't asked you to read this, but it's a typical Wordsworth um, advocating idleness. I just want to, emphasize the role of irony. Um, let's see, and well, the critique of the calendar, the mechanical time. No joyless form shall regulate our living calendar. From today, my friend, will date the opening of the year. And again, that the importance of friend. It's addressed to his sister, but he's redefining their relationship. I'm going to emphasize this point about social regeneration. We're recreating ourselves. Like he's creating the taste by which we enjoy him, and reading is a recreating of our social organization in terms of this radical equality, friendship. Um, from today, my friend, will date the opening of the year. So, I'm writing my own calendar in my own pace of life that I'm feeling intuitively. Love, now a universal birth, from heart to heart a stealing, from earth to man, from man to earth. It is the hour of feeling. One moment now may give us more than years of toiling reason. Our minds shall drink at every pore the spirit of the season. Our minds shall drink at every pore, body and mind. Some silent laws our hearts will make, which they so long obey. We for the year to come may take our temper from today, and from the blessed power that rolls about above below, above, will frame the measure of our souls. They shall be tuned to love. Mm-hmm. So we're getting tuned by the poem. Remember, the world is too much with us. Has talked about the frustration of being out of tune with getting and spending. We're reframing a new standard of measurement, a new calendar, new measure of time. Then come, my sister, come, I pray, with speed put on your woodland dress, and bring no book, for this one day will give to idleness. Concluding irony, it's like we're reading about giving up reading. And I just want to emphasize that irony is what releases us to the song, the spirit of feeling. It's mobilized by confounding the terms of the mind that would regulate our experience. Now that it's the poem doing it, that it's just mediating this overpowering feeling, organizing it, communicating it by way of its formal poetic measures. The music becomes a measure, a new way of organizing life. In considering the social power of music, considering the critical power of just poetic music, just the experience of the music of poetry, it seems, what could be less consequential than that? But consider this, I've talked about poetry as the body language of language. It's making use of the material effects of language, how the words happen to sound. It's using these effects to push back on the abstract meanings of the words and play with them. But I think most people agree. Well, I don't know about most people, but a very compelling, widely shared conception of the origin of language is that it drew out of music. We communicated first by music, and then language developed out of that. So there's a way in which our prioritization of language over musical communication is an inversion of the developmental priority of music. And that's certainly the case in any event, whether that's true or not in terms of the development evolution. It certainly is true about the development of individuals. We communicate first with our mother's body, rhythmically, in terms of sound, long before we learn language. In utero, but then also as in the first years of life, most communication is quite musical. A lot of studies have been done about the use of tone, inflection, and rhythm in the communication between parents and the child. Another thing that I think is interesting to think about is speculation about the origin of language. Has to do with the development of the humans' society. So we developed out of small tribal units into larger, social units like, cities. There's a hypothesis that music developed as a replacement for physical grooming, which was possible, a key means of social bonding in smaller groups. Um, that is grooming one another. I've talked about, gossip as a kind of moral grooming. Um, this is it's a kind of social bonding. Like we tell stories about each other to um, put our intuitions and our feelings, our emotions and judgments kind of in sync. Um, music is it's a way of coordinating bodies and emotions on a larger scale, that in a larger social unit that wouldn't accommodate personal grooming of everybody. We can sync up through music, and music is incredibly demanding in terms of the brain takes a lot of brain power. It takes a lot of vocal power. It's rare for animals to develop the capacity for song. So a lot of work gets put in on an evolutionary uh, development into developing the capacity for music. And interestingly, we share this capacity with birds, but not with our closest primate. Chimps can't do it, can't sing, but birds can. And we share this thing with birds, that that music, the brain structures that control music. Um, Whales do very complex communication by way of music. Um, so when I say poetry is the body language of language, I want to suggest that it's most of our communication, the deepest, most powerful kind of communication is body language. I think that's also something to think about, is how little of our communication is actually verbal. And even sometimes I wondered, like, if what we say verbally is often sort of a alibi or rationalization, or disguise, um, suppression of what we're really communicating um, through body language. Um, the Another thing to think about here, thinking about birdsong and whales, for example, um, has to do with the social nature of these species. So they're big. They use their song to coordinate socially. They're not just individuals, but uh, they are extending beyond themselves in their song, and coordinating socially. Um, and It's interesting. People talk about an um, audio environment, like there are different ways in which uh, ecosystem is filled out and organized, um, and people talk about it, the environmental damage in terms of the loss of diversity in an ecosystem. And they say the same thing about the sort of audible environment, that diverse um, sounds in an environment is a sign of ecological health. So you can think of like an ecosystem of sound. Birds, if you're in a forest or something where there are lots of different kinds of birds and insects, it's really amazing to see how each sort of holds a different place or different kind of rhythm or tone or whatever. All these different audible characteristics are uh, diversifies across the audible environment. Um, and so I think it's interesting, I think part of what I want to suggest has to do with the way in which our perception, we perceive primarily through our eyes. We individuate um, people by their bodies. Um, but I think, if you think about other senses, there's other ways of thinking about how organisms manifest themselves in the world. And to think of, these social um, forms of interaction as extensions of the body, that they're really, these um, birds are really interwoven by their song. Um, and I think that's an interesting way of thinking about us too. That language is a way in which our bodies actually interact. I mean, again, sound is body experience. It actually vibrates on our eardrum and um, not just our eardrum, on our bodies. So it's like touch. We physically are um, interwoven through language um, in a way that's, I think, very helpful to think about music. Um, Another theory I've heard about the development of language in evolution is that when tribes or societies are competing, that music get capacity to play music in coordination, especially like rhythm in coordination, was very intimidating and made, it's a sort of made you sound very big, right? If you can play music in coordination, it creates this coordinated, you know, uh, embodied effect. That collective sound, that integrated collective sound, um, and that becomes a means of social recognition. You are recognized as the sound you make, um, uh, and yeah, and that's an important way to think about music. Like music creates community, creates identity. How you or community um, is recognized socially. So it's a different body. It's putting a different embodied representative in circulation in society. Um, so I hope that's suggests, I think, the subversive power at stake here. Vernacular poetry is putting into circulation new voices, acknowledging new kinds of experience, and very powerful ways. New bodies are getting communicated. New kinds of bodies are getting communicated. Um, and the access to communication, the means of communication is getting democratized. Um, so that's what I meant to say, that there's something kind of punk rock about Wordsworth, and that universal availability and of art and acknowledgement of bodies. Ordinary bodies and marginalized bodies. Um, and I think the other thing to keep in mind about Wordsworth, that he really emphasizes in the preface, is that it's all about pleasure. And again, that's the principal um, prerequisite of poetry is, regardless of whatever else it is, it has to be enjoyable. Language for the sake of pleasure. Um, Whatever it's saying, it's just, it has to be pleasurable, and that's related to the idea of idleness. It has no purpose. It's idle. It's just singing for the sake of singing, and seducing us away from proper values, proper use of language, proper, productive use of your time, uh, out for the sake of the sheer pleasure of uh, the music, of the language, and the sheer pleasure of communication. Um, Again, there's something profound at stake, kind of metaphysical. We are saying who we are um, by communicating in this musical way. We're performing who we are. Think about the role of music in demonstrations. This and the effect of demonstrations of defining a community. This embodied collective is defined by the act of collecting together, assembling. It's true in terms of our bodies, our actual bodies, and I want to say it's true in terms of our literary communication. The principal source of poetic pleasure for Wordsworth, and maybe all pleasure, is what he calls the perception of similitude in dissimilitude. This principle is the great spring of the activity of our minds and their chief feeder. From this principle, the direction of the sexual appetite and all passions connected with it take their origin. It is the life of our ordinary conversation, and upon the accuracy with which similitude and dissimilitude and similitude are perceived depend our taste and our moral feelings. So this is what's at stake in irony, sort of toggling back and forth between different meanings. Communicating ironically means sharing that duality, that perception of similitude and dissimilitude, identity and difference. And that's what's at stake in music, into like syncopation, a mind kind of reflecting on the body in a rhythmic way that can be communicated. That's again a kind of weaving together of embodied experience, the experience of mind, coordinating bodies like music does, in a way that our normal objective perception keeps bodies apart. Our conception of objective reality isolates us. So our verbal representation, normal verbal objective representation in language, insists on our individuation, as does our consumption and Protestant work ethic. It's all individuating. So this collective experience, pleasure of music and poetry, irony and meaning, is very subversive of the basic tenets of our world, the basic way in which our world is organized. You might think about the difference between musical communication and didactic communication. So the transmission of knowledge from the teacher to the student. It's information supposedly, goes from one head to the other. There's no bodily component to it. There's these two opposed ways of building meaning. Syntax and narratives construct meaning and communicate meaning. Hypotaxis is like syllogisms. We have an initial premise, a secondary premise, and that builds to a conclusion. It's a cumulative construction of meaning. Narrative works in the same way, builds meaning by the cumulative effect of a series of events build up to some kind of lesson that is the moral of the tale. For instance, in The Fly, everything turns on this syllogism, this I think, therefore I am. It's drawing a conclusion from that if-then statement. And what Blake shows in poems like this that are interrogating certain narratives or moral dogma, The Garden of Love, The Little Black Boy, The Chimney Sweeper, The Tiger, is how embodied time gets left out. In The Fly, he's somehow created a sense of reality and of himself where his own body doesn't matter anymore. Even as he's singing a poem, it's like I could just as well not be here. I'm singing a poem about non-existence. So he's showing how this syllogism has drawn himself out of his body into this realm of reality that really is predicated on denigrating the body, just as in the Garden of Love. In the Garden of Love, it just turns into graves. Now, in The Little Black Boy, what's interesting is that it seems like a syllogism is created in the poem to reverse the logic of racism, according to which the impure black body, instead of being impure, becomes a mark of God's love. It bears the beams of the God's sun shining on the boy. So there, it seems like that lesson is learned or taught in the poem, but that appearance is belied by the ultimate conclusion of the poem, where the little black boy is left waiting for the little white boy to love him. He will then love me. He's still waiting. Is suspended. His own body is suspended. Even though he thinks he's been released from racism, he's heard a story that tells him why he needn't be ashamed of his black body. In effect, in practice, he's still waiting for the English boy to love him. Likewise, the Chimney Sweeper, even though it's among the songs of innocence and it bears a redemptive message, ostensibly, sort of seems like the little black boy. If you read strictly for the narrative and the sort of argument logic of the semantic content of the poem, it seems like we're all going to heaven. There's nothing to worry about. And Tom, even though it was cold, he awoke warm. But the effect of the poem on the practical performative level, the reader sees this is delusion. You've just talked yourself out of noticing your dark, bleak condition, just like the little black boy. So on this topic of two different kinds of time, there's a powerful little section of a speech by Martin Luther King I'd like to play for you.
It may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability, It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right.
I think Blake is getting at something similar when he says eternity is in love with the productions of time. Waiting on time, change never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability, is like killing time. Passive disregard of your actual time, your actual experience of time, out of deference to some kind of abstract narrative, inevitability, a sense of a transcendent, overriding truth you're relying on. We must help time. We must do time somehow in the present. And that's why music is such a helpful analogy, if not, a literal vehicle of meaningful historical action. These videos suggest how much he was learning from his environment, taking from his environment, and incorporating it in his poetry.
Blake was an extraordinary original when it came to his thinking, his emphasis upon imagination, his antipathy toward, for example, to use but perhaps one of his best known expressions, the dark satanic mills, the grinding, the machinery, all these things that seem to dehumanize his fellow man. And there, right in the middle of his life, is this machine, this large, lumping, huge, wooden, heavy machine with this great star wheel that takes enormous pressure to turn, and it creaks like a sailing ship, and is absolutely at the center of his life. He's not a Shelley or a Wordsworth or a Keats with a fine quill pen and ethereal thoughts, staring up to heaven and glancing through his manuscripts and leisurely leaning back and contemplating what he's written and then passing it to his publisher to put it into press. Blake is a mechanic. He's this extraordinary man who is physical. Blake was not a big man, but he was enormously strong, enormously powerful. Yet, the creator of these extraordinary ideas and these extraordinary poems that just go right to the quick of our imagination and our heartthrob as human beings.
He sang his poetry, always, whenever he got the chance to. We don't know exactly what melodies he employed, but we know he would sing to friends. He'd sing at parties, he'd sing to his wife, and sing to, in gatherings. In a sense, he thought of himself as a bard. Now, it's important to remember that for him, the bardic voice was something very, very central. It was almost the origin of his genius. He had read the Bible as a child. He had read Milton. And he thought in combining the Bible, combining Milton, he was creating a public voice and a prophetic voice which would reawaken the spiritual longings of the English people.
But the soul of sweet delight can never be defiled. To create a little flower is the wisdom of ages. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, and he smiling said to me,
Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed, and I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs every child may joy to hear.
Blake himself used instruments of the day, probably the church organ or the pump organ or harmonium. And what I have here in my lap is a miniature pump organ. It has a bellows and keys. It has 2.5 octaves. So it's probably not that different from the instrument that Blake may have used.
He was an 18th century Londoner in an 18th century setting. So what was he listening to? Street ballads, popular songs, the Methodist hymns of the period, all the songs and airs in the air around him, and those are precisely the sources from which some of his great lyrics spring.
There was a lass of Islington, as I've heard many tell, and she would to fair London go, find apples and pears to sell. And as along the streets she flung with her basket on her arm, her pears to sell, you may know it right well, this fair made men no harm.
Blake was the greatest poet of London, in the sense that its sounds and sights and images and words reverberate through his prophetic books as well as through his lyrics. But for him, London was not just the city of the poor and the repressed, as it was, but it was also the city he called Infinite London, spiritual fourfold London. He saw eternity in the streets of London. For him, it was a visionary city as well as a real city, and he could understand the visionary truth of his own imagination, even as he walked through the streets of London.
I behold London, a human awful wonder of God. He says, return, Albion, return. I give myself for thee. My streets are my ideas of imagination. I write in South Molton Street what I both see and hear. I see thee, awful parent land, in light. Behold, I see.
When I was a child, I had a similar experience where I was on, I think it was Kingsway, and I was walking down Kingsway, and very suddenly the people walking through the streets, the traffic, the hive of movement, suddenly was transformed into lines of light, which seemed to have some ulterior and grander movement, which I didn't quite understand. But I was realized at that time that London itself could be seen as an organism, and Blake himself has the very same sense. So for him, London was a spiritual reality. It was part of the divine vision.
The fields from Islington to Marylebone, to Primrose Hill and St. John's Wood, were builded over with pillars of gold, and there Jerusalem's pillars stood.
The word joy is so great in Blake. It's like an image of music. He turns the noun into a verb in The Little Black Boy. Together we joy. The language of mother and child and infant joy. The word joy becomes a refrain, a rhythm, a rhythmic kind of communication between the parent and child. Turning the noun, something you think you know, joy is a thing, into something you do. Joy is what joy does. So let's look at this beautiful poem. We talked in Thel about the infant smile. So what's this, speechless, I have no name. Like, it's so paradoxical to think of he's giving speech to this speechless infant. Again, that's what infant literally means, is speechless. Unspoken dialogue. He's translating a communication of maybe sounds between a mother and an infant, or parent and an infant, or just bodies resonating, just like the clod and the pebble. That poem is like a translation of sounds in the environment. What shall I call thee? I happy am. Joy is my name. Sweet joy befall thee. Pretty joy, sweet joy but 2 days old. Sweet joy I call thee. Thou dost smile, I sing the while. Sweet joy befall thee. It's like the parent and child cooing to one another. They're doing joy more than they're saying it. And this one's heartbreaking to read in comparison. And remember, the word piping is key word in the introduction. That evokes music, like the dove's voice, the music in the air. It's a music that goes unheard. This reminds me of the moment when we get to Frankenstein, the moment in which the creature is born, and Victor Frankenstein can only see, grotesque body parts. He can't see a human, expression. The creature could be smiling at him, but he can only see this mechanical, grotesque matter. That's what is described here. There's no echo. Infant hears no echo. There's no communication. It's so heartbreaking. I sulk upon my mother's breast. So Blake suggests communication is always about translation. If communication is just mechanical repetition, it's not communication at all. This translation between bodies is what the joy, bouncing back and forth between these different voices is what makes it communication. He really is emphasizing a musical conception of how communication works, as is Martin Luther King. The time is always right to do right. So what it means to do right somehow has to be embodied in time, to be right now in time, has to be enacted. That's what I mean by parataxis. So parataxis, rather than accumulating meaning, parataxis is rhythmic. It means parallel. Paratactic syntax just gives successive examples or instances. My joy, your joy. Time is always right to do right. I'm not explaining a meaning, building a syllogism, an argument, or a narrative. I'm communicating by this kind of repetition, serial array of examples. Another great example of that is the introduction. Interesting thing to look at here is just all the different media. So it starts with piping songs, laughter, weeping, and then singing. Sing thy songs of happy cheer. So translate the music, translate the song of the air into music that you pipe on your pipe, translate that music into a song that you can sing, and then finally translate that into writing. This is a paratactic series of repetitions of the same song. So the meaning of the writing finally comes not from the syntax, the abstract meaning of the words, but from the way in which it resonates with the environment, with the body, with the musical instrument. The text is situated in this environmental array of communications, media, and sounds, and embodied rhythms. He plucks a hollow reed, he writes with the environment, and the writing as if to underscore the kind of opacity of his meaning. The meaning is paradoxical. I stained the water clear. I polluted the environment. The sort of most obvious way to read that is I made ink from the water to write with, but it also suggests a counterpart of defiling the environment. So, and again, every child may joy to hear that use of the noun as a verb, emphasizing this tension between the ostensible definition, lesson, and the practical performance of meaning. Another great example of the musical construction of meaning. I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. There's something cathartic about this translation of meaning into performance, putting it outside, putting it in your body, rather than holding it. Just like that, proverb of hell, this standing water turns poisonous. The overflow is creative. The nurse's song literally acts out a kind of music, seduction by music, sort of contagious rhythm. The nurse tells the children it's time to go in, it's getting dark, the dews of night arise. It's their risk. It's like the sick rose. Disease night is dangerous, but the nurse allows herself to be seduced by the children's song. And I like how that's announced in the title. It's the nurse's song. It's she makes it her own. I like how this authority figure who begins trying to impose a rule, keep night and day separate, segregate black and white, child and adult, the realm of play with the realm of discipline. That she is within the circle of singing children. She's depicted here on the same level, whereas in the song of experience, there's a clear like hierarchy, like disciplinary control, a vertical segregation is entailed by it imposing that adult rule, the segregation of night and day. And in the Song of Innocence, Blake translates this equalizing, putting the nurse and children all on the same level, all participating in the same song. He translates that into the sound of his poem, including these accent markers. He makes, and concluding the poem with the word echo, he makes the sound, he makes this poem itself echo. The little ones leaped and shouted and laughed, and all the hills echoed. He's making us act out the very echo that he's describing. That's an important thing, I think, to keep in mind when we look at the tiger. The tiger depicts, like the little black boy, an ideological, mind-forged manacle, an inability to think of authority, creative power. Who could frame thy fearful symmetry? Otherwise than in terms of tyrannical, coercive power. So as the poem proceeds, the only examples, only metaphors for creative power you can come up with are these analogies for industrial power, mechanism, machinery, the anvil, the chain, the hammer, the furnace. So it shows how the speaker of the poem, his imagination is ideologically limited and prescriptive to thinking about power as tyrannical and coercive, and vertical, hierarchical, which keeps him from actually even seeing the tiger finally. This conception of the fearful symmetry becomes finally blinding. All the poet can conceive by the end is this unfathomable creative power. Who dare frame thy fearful symmetry? This switch in the course of the poem, who could? It's just a question more of curiosity, wondering, maybe paying attention to the tiger. What could be the cause? By the end of the poem, it's who dare the fearful symmetry. It's moved from something, potentially just awesome and curiosity provoking to simply terrifying, an expression of exclusively intimidating power. So it's a poem about a kind of paranoia. Another thing to notice here, just talking about the echo, the rhythm, the experience of music, is the trochaic beat of the poem. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, is very evocative of the heartbeat that is being interrogated. So that, which is to say, again, we in our experience of the poem are the creators. We're the ones that are making the heartbeat. And the questioning is alienating ourselves from our own bodies, again, much like in The Little Black Boy. The Lamb satirizes the teacher-student relationship. It begins with this kind of catechism, rhetorical questioning. Little lamb, who made thee? It's the kind of questions they ask little kids in school, like there's an answer, there's a correct answer you're supposed to know. I'm not asking because it's like a catechism in church, a kind of mechanical rehearsal of a prescribed question and answer. But in this case, it's the child that's asking the question. So he's subverting the usual scenario where it's the teacher asking it of a child. But at first it seems he's maintaining a kind of hierarchy because it's the child asking it of even lower positioned animal on the hierarchy. And you can see the paratactic form, this repetition, it's mimicking catechism and rhetorical questioning in class. But the poem in the second stanza reverses and then complicates this hierarchy and turns it into a kind of waltz. So he says, you made you, you are God. So all of a sudden, the lowest position on the hierarchy, the lamb, becomes the highest position. It's so simple, and yet it's incredibly moving, I think. He became a little child, I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. So it's like God, animal, child, all become interchangeable positions in a kind of musical rhythm. It's a rhythm of thinking, desire, imagining God and experiencing the earth, the animal, embodiment are all put into a kind of musical patterning. So, little lamb, God bless thee. Who's saying that to who? It's a phrase that we're all participating in together. And I think the lack of punctuation here, lamb, God, thee, who's talking to who, about whom, it's all scrambled in a way that's beatific. It's psychedelic. That sense of dissolving into the environment has a kind of erotic overflowing, to use Blake's term. So Blake learns from the same ideology of hierarchy, of pedagogy, the church dogma. He learns from it by subverting it. He deconstructs the ideological presumption of a hierarchy. That vertical structure is deconstructed, but he uses it to create this kind of dance of interchangeable positions in the hierarchy. Lamb and child and God all become teacher and student, a music of exchanging positions. It's like Cloud and the Pebble, just as in that poem, he starts out with a stark binary, conceptual binary between being selfish and being selfless. But the examples, the Cloud and the Pebble, turn out to deconstruct it because there are complexities in the illustration of the dogma that are at odds with the dogma and that end up deconstructing it. So it's in a way, it's like our sensuous experience is more intelligent than ideas that are supposed to understand our sensuous experience. Same thing here. This is even, I think, more subtle and interesting. Its juxtaposition of time, temporal life, embodied life, and transcendence. Begins by saying, weary of time, who countest the steps of the sun. So the sunflower just has its eye on eternity, like a monk or something. I'm weary of time. I'm just have my eye on eternity, on the sweet golden climb where the traveler's journey is done, the end of life. But then the way in which that endpoint, the opposite of time, eternity, when time is over, the hereafter, the way in which that hereafter is illustrated or evoked, the metaphors just keep reintroducing time. So then we get like a rhythm again, like God and the Lamb. The more we try to evoke the opposite of time, the hierarchy, the sweet hereafter, the more we're put back into time as a kind of rhythm. So where the youth pined away with desire and the pale virgin shrouded in snow arise from their graves and aspire where my sunflower wishes to go. So I hope you can get a sense of how, like, the poem turns in on itself. I'm trying to evoke the end point of time, the afterlife, this realm of eternity where the youth and the virgin are sort of immortalized. But even to conceive them is to resurrect them. They arise and aspire to their own further sun. It turns into a rhythm of perpetual resurrection and reimagining, just like the Lamb and God and child. This is even grammatically evoked in this juxtaposition of the youth and the virgin. Look at all the words, the different ways in which Blake evokes the activity of desire: seeking, counting, journeying, traveling, pining, arising, aspiring. This little poem about the hereafter is saturated with desire, as if, with sunlight, where the youth pined away with desire and the pale virgin shrouded in snow. There's a grammatical contortion here that I think is amazing. The youth pined, that's an active, expression of desire. Virgin shrouded, it's a passive reception of the snow. Symmetrical counterpart to the pining of youth, that we read it as if it were active. The tensions in the narrative complicate what its ostensible message, what seems to be clear story about waiting for the afterlife, turns out to be anything but. Just saturates us in the body, in the here and now, in the movement of desire, of perpetual wishing, aspiring, and so on.